Next presentation, Findings of Abuse in Families Affected by Parental Alienation, presented by Demosthenes Lorandos and Amanda Sharples. This video?
Hi, can everyone hear me and see my slides? Okay, good. Sorry I couldn't be there in person today. I was going to originally provide a recording of this talk, but I decided to try to do this live. So I hope everything goes well and we don't have any technical issues. So I'm going to talk today about some research that was recently published looking at findings of abuse in families affected by parental alienation. So this is work that I was doing with Doctors Jennifer Harman and Demosthenes Lorandos, and we just recently published this in the Journal of Family Violence. So you can get more detailed information on the study there. I'm just going to, do a summary of the logic behind our research question, the methods we used, our main findings, as well as the limitations and future directions of this research. Sorry. There we go. All right. So we do know that the use of children as weapons is a central feature in our definitions of intimate partner violence. This has come up in previous talks, which I've really looked forward, really enjoyed watching. So thank you for that. And indeed, when we look at coercively controlling abuse specifically, there's quite a number of parallels between that form of abuse and parental alienating behaviors. Indeed, these are really about using the children after separation and divorce primarily to still have some sort of control over the other parent, and also, of course, controlling the children as a way of doing that. And also, when we look at the original wheel of power and control, one of the key pieces of that wheel is the use of children. So making the abused party feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages to the abused party, which is a behavior we see with parental alienation, and threatening to take the children away from the abused party. And indeed, people that are in abusive relationships, and especially ones where there's coercively controlling abuse, often fear that that is something that will happen if they do leave the relationship. Research has also found that parents that use parental alienating behaviors tend to have similar characteristics to parents that engage in other abusive behaviors. So these types of traits are related to cluster B personality disorders. These are disorders like antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. And so these traits have to do with emotional volatility. So kind of not being able to control your emotions, maybe reacting in a very volatile way to relatively minor transgressions or to seeing your former partner get into a new relationship. These can involve things like a sense of grandiosity and entitlement, feeling like you are entitled to, for example, have full control of the children or full custody of the children. And these can involve a complete lack of empathy, not being able to take the perspective of or to care about the feelings of the other parent. So those are just some examples of traits that we see both in parents that use these parental alienating behaviors, as well as parents that engage in other forms of abuse. So I'm not going to go through all of this in too much detail for the sake of time, but this is a reconceptualized version of the wheel of power and control. So this is taken from a chapter by Dr. Jennifer Harman and Dr. Mandy Matthewson. And this illustration was created by Amanda Sillers. And it's just looking at the relationship between these parental alienating behaviors and the original categories in this wheel of power and control. So again, using the child as a weapon, obviously a key feature of parental alienation. So you put them in the middle of your dispute. Minimizing responsibility, blaming, denying. So again, alienating parents often don't want to take responsibility for their negative behaviors, maybe can't even see what they're doing wrong. They minimize the authority of the court. They often don't follow court orders. Alienating parents will use economic abuse. They will control and harm the child and targeted parent through economic means. Obviously, if a parent has to continuously go back to court just to see their child, that's going to be very expensive over time, and it may get to a point where they just can't do it. Using physical or sexual abuse behaviors. So there's often threats of physical abuse towards the targeted parent or the child. Third parties can be involved, for example, at transitions when the child is meant to go, for example, with a targeted parent, third parties may be there and convey threatening messages or be threatening figures to the targeted parent. The children may be threatened with violence if they don't comply with the alienating parent's wishes. Using threats and intimidation, so stalking and harassing the targeted parent, stalking them through the child, having the child get information when they're with a targeted parent, or even hiring private investigators to follow the targeted parent, legal and administrative aggression, which we'll talk about here, so making false allegations of abuse, for example. Staging events, so staging an event where the child may react negatively towards the targeted parent, or where you may make the targeted parent look bad in a public setting. Using coercion, again, this is about part of coercively controlling abuse, so requiring the child to be loyal, for the alienating parent requiring that, coercing them to reject and fear the TP, the targeted parent, so making them kind of believe that they need to do that for the alienating parent if they want to be loyal to them. And part of that is adultifying them, making them feel like they're responsible for the feelings of the alienating parent, and creating this enmeshed relationship where they almost can't feel separate from the alienating parent. Using isolation, so isolating the child from the targeted parent and from all the social supports that come with the targeted parent. Using privilege of gender, so using specific gender stereotypes we have of men and women to make claims that the other parent is a bad parent, and using your custodial status, if you have the status of being the custodial parent, as a way of gaining advantage in custody disputes. Using emotional abuse, obviously a big part of parental alienation. And I mean, many of these other behaviors we talked about could be considered emotional abuse, but a big part of it is brainwashing the child, making them believe that the targeted parent is a bad person. And then anyone associated with them or that supports them is a bad person, is someone they should fear or be angry towards. And diminishing the parental role of the targeted parent. So really undermining their authority and encouraging the child to disrespect them. So those are just some examples I wanted to go through. But what we wanted to do in this paper is really look at what is actually happening in these family court cases where we have findings of parental alienation and we have claims of abuse that may or may not be substantiated. Is it really that the alienated parent is the one that is abusive, or is it, which is more consistent with our theory, that the alienating parent has a history of abuse? Co-occurring forms of abuse. And this is really important because people that are still very critical of parental alienation theory, and this has already come up quite a bit in these talks, have argued that this is merely a legal defense that's used by abusive parents, and in particular fathers, to maintain access to their children. But there's no credible evidence to support this. As has already been noted, this research hasn't been peer reviewed, hasn't been published in credible journals, and isn't very transparent. However, the research that has been transparent and scientifically rigorous, so the work by Drs. Jennifer Harman and Demosthenes Lorandos that was published in 2021, did not find support for this claim. Courts aren't just taking children and placing them with abusive parents just because they're claiming they've been alienated. There's been other arguments that there's just not enough evidence to support the claim that alienation may be a form of abuse. However, we have a growing body of evidence, theoretical papers that have been written, the excellent paper written by Dr. Harman, Kruk, and Hines that looked at how this can be conceptualized as a form of family violence. And also we have, and this was noted in the paper recently published in the Journal of Developmental Psychology, quite a large body of evidence that shows how detrimental this is to children across many different domains in their life. This impacts their self-esteem. It impacts their mental health. They're more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, to have substance abuse issues. It may affect them academically. It's likely to affect their interpersonal relationships and their relationships with their own children in the future. So it's affecting them in many ways, and in ways that are similar to how children that experience other forms of abuse are impacted. So the purpose of the current study was to empirically examine whether alienating parents are abusive or engage in abusive behaviors that span multiple categories. Because evidence of this co-occurring victimization may provide support for the theory that parental alienating patterns or behaviors, sorry, are sometimes a pattern of behavior that's used by a coercively controlling abusive parent to maintain power and control. Because after the dissolution of a relationship, the use of children to maintain control, that might be the only means that they have. We had a number of hypotheses that we pre-registered, and you can see all of these on the Open Science Framework. We weren't able to touch on all of them in this paper, and I'm not able to touch on all of them in this talk, but all of the analyses are provided on the OSF page. So if you'd like to look at all of those, you're welcome to do that. Our first hypothesis is that when there is a finding of parental alienation, there's a higher likelihood of finding a substantiated claim of abuse against the alienating parent than the alienated or targeted parent. And our second hypothesis, which is related to the way that alienating parents use legal and administrative aggression against the targeted parent, is that when there is a finding of parental alienation, there is a higher likelihood of finding an unsubstantiated claim of abuse against the alienated or targeted parent rather than the alienating parent. So to test our hypotheses, we used an existing sample of appellate cases in which parental alienation was known or alleged. And actually, we specifically in this research focused on the cases in which it was known. So this was data that was collected by Jen and Demos for their original paper. So our sample, again, we only looked at cases where PA was found to have occurred by an independent evaluating expert or the court. And so we had a total of 492 cases, 254 where the father was the alienating parent and 247 where the mother was the alienating parent. So relatively equal in terms of gender. We had two different Excel spreadsheets that we were working with. So the first spreadsheet was the original spreadsheet that was created for the Harman and Lorandos 2021 paper. This lists all the details for the case. Who was the alienating parent? What were some of the outcomes of that particular case with respect to things like custody and access? The second spreadsheet contained all the claims of abuse that were made in each case. So it contained all the details, things like what kind of abuse was it? When did it occur? Who was the alleged perpetrator? Who was the alleged victim? Who was involved in determining whether this was a substantiated or not substantiated or a credible claim of abuse? And then, like I mentioned here, there were two columns. One was the outcome of investigation. So that specific abuse events investigation, did they find that it occurred or not? Or did they not have enough evidence? And then final court judgment within the family court, what was found? Did they substantiate or validate that allegation of abuse? And so here, again, with the code book, we used those two columns to create our abuse claims variable. And this was coded to indicate whether it was substantiated. So was it clear? Did the courts clearly say, yes, this happened? Or a third party say, yes, this abuse definitely happened, or the perpetrator admitted that they did it? Was it unsubstantiated? So often in the coding, it would specifically say unsubstantiated or unfounded. Sometimes it was quite clearly a false claim in that the alleged victim would recount their statement that they were abused or would admit that it was a false allegation of abuse. And often it was unclear. So these were appellate cases. There was minimal detail, unfortunately. So sometimes it would, say it was unclear, or they wouldn't even talk about the outcome of the investigation. So we had to just code those as unclear, and we couldn't really include them in some of our analyses. I coded these claims, but we also had an independent research assistant who was unaware of the study's hypotheses code these claims as well, to make sure that we were on the same page. And the coding spreadsheet is available on our OSF page, as well as detailed comments in any instances where our coding differed to explain how we resolved those coding differences. Often they were just simple errors. Looking at our results, so looking at the descriptives kind of going on in these cases, across the 492 cases where parental alienation was found to have occurred, 41.46% of them didn't involve any claims of abuse. So kind of similar to the Canadian data that Christine was talking about, almost half the time people aren't even making claims of abuse. 25% involved claims of abuse against the father. Just over 22% involved claims made by both parties. And just over 11% involved claims against the mother. So testing our first hypothesis, we did find support for this. So there was a significant main effect such that we were more likely to find substantiated claims of abuse against the alienating parent as opposed to the alienated parent. Our odds ratio was 4.44, which is a medium effect size. So this just suggests that, yes, it's more likely in these cases that the alienating parent has a history of co-occurring abuse. And kind of looking at the descriptives here, you can see that when it's an alienating mother that's accused of abuse, just over 5% of the time, these are substantiated. When it's an alienating father that's accused of abuse, about 10.5% of the time, it's substantiated. Again, it's not a lot. It's still more likely that these claims were unsubstantiated, but it's more than what we see when we look at the targeted parents. So when the targeted parent's a father, well, close to 2.5% of the time, it was substantiated. And when it's a mother, just over 2.5% of the time, the abuse claim was substantiated. I did run a model where we only looked at domestic violence. So this model included all types of abuse, but we also wanted to look at this as a pattern specifically of intimate partner violence or violence towards the targeted parent. And we do still find a significant effect, but our odds ratio does decrease a bit. It's about 3.6 or something like that. Looking at our results for hypothesis 2, we also found support for this. So our results indicated a main effect such that there was a significantly greater likelihood of finding an unsubstantiated abuse claim against the alienated parent or targeted parent compared to the alienating parent. So again, the odds ratio is quite high here at 6.17, which is a large effect. So what we see here is that when the accusing parent is the mother and the accused party is not alienating, the percentage of unsubstantiated claims is close to 50%. And when the accusing parent is the father and the accused party is not alienating, the unsubstantiated abuse claims are almost 22%. However, when we look at when it's the alienating party and the accusing parent is the mother, the unsubstantiated claims are just over 8%. And when the accusing parent is the father and the accused party is alienating, the unsubstantiated claims are just over or are right at 5%. So they're much lower compared to when it's the party that's not alienating. I'm going to talk a bit about the limitations, but definitely we have limited detail. So definitely some of these were very clearly false allegations of abuse. It's possible that in some cases a parent was maybe exaggerating something that happened. It's possible that in some cases there wasn't enough evidence. Usually if it was explicitly stated that there wasn't enough evidence, we'd code that as unclear. But again, we have limited detail on some of these appellate cases. So we are hoping to replicate these findings with that wonderful Canadian data set that's been collected, that's been talked about already here today. So just to summarize, the current research found that alienating parents, regardless of gender, I should also note that in both the models that I presented for hypothesis 1 and 2, we also included gender as a predictor, and we didn't find a main effect of that. So regardless of gender, alienating parents had a greater probability of having a substantiated claim of abuse against them compared to the parents that were found to have been alienated from their children. And related to our hypothesis that alienating parents may also use legal and administrative aggression, one of these things being false allegations of abuse, we also found that parents alienated from their children had a greater probability of having unsubstantiated claims of abuse made against them than the parent that was accused or found to have been alienating their children. I do think I didn't talk about strengths here, but I do think a key strength of our study is we're working with real cases, right? So we're trying to get an objective picture of what's going on, rather than just asking parents their perceptions of, what's happened to them in the relationship and their perceptions of how they're being alienated from their children, which is very important work to be doing. Now we're looking more objectively on what's going on in the courts here. So putting this all together and the strengths of both of these methods, I think that's very important. But there are limitations, of course, to doing this as well. So parental alienation is a complex concept to define. So as Dr. Burnett was discussing in the opening, session. We've come a long way with that. There's the 5-factor model developed by Dr. Burnett and Dr. Amy Baker. And the encouraging thing is that in some recent research that's been done, there does seem to be more of a consensus amongst legal professionals as to what parental alienation is. But there's a lot to it, right? There's many different categories of parental alienating behaviors, many different things that need to be examined within the family in order to determine whether this is occurring or not. And so basically that means that, it may not always be entirely accurate, but with anything we measure, there's no, perfect accuracy. There's always going to be some noise in our data. Our sample only contained United States appellate cases because that's all that was publicly available in the United States. And again, these have minimal detail compared to what you might find in a trial record. Also, not everyone can afford to go to appeals court. Again, it requires a lot of resources. And so this may not generalize to all families that are experiencing parental alienation. So as I already mentioned, I'm hoping to look at some of this Canadian data that's been collected, looking at trial records. There's more information there about the specific kind of parental alienating behaviors that are being used, and to see if we can replicate these findings. And a challenge in studying the relationship between parental alienating behaviors and other forms of abuse is that sometimes these behaviors may be classified as other forms of abuse. We looked at that in the power and control wheel, right? Physical abuse can be used as an alienation tactic. Alienation, a lot of the psychological behaviors that parents engage in and what they're trying to do with their children may be conceptualized as emotional abuse. So one thing I did notice in going through and encoding in these spreadsheets is that, yes, sometimes when there was an emotional abuse claim, it actually was a parental alienating behavior. I did remove those when I could find them. But it's possible that, again, with the lack of detail, they weren't all caught. I also ran a model where we did not include emotional abuse claims at all, just to see if our results would hold. And they did. In fact, our odds ratio increased slightly with that model. In terms of future directions, I didn't get to talk about this as much as I would have liked in the paper. Obviously, we want to replicate our findings. Replication is very important with a new sample and in different countries where the legal systems may be a bit different, the laws may be a bit different, and where we may have more information available about what is happening in these cases. I think it may also be important to look more closely at false claims of parental alienation as well, because one of the arguments we're making here is that parents that maybe have a history of abuse and that may be using parental alienating behaviors may also use legal and administrative aggression by making false allegations of abuse that they may actually be engaging in themselves. Well, it may also be the case that parents make false claims of parental alienation as a form of legal and administrative aggression. And in some of these cases, it's kind of seems to be that these are the parents that are actually using parental alienating behaviors. They're just backfiring. So being, better able to recognize the specific behaviors. And it's really actually encouraging to see that in a lot of these cases, the judges are able to do that. So even when a parent is claiming they were alienated, but maybe they were actually the one using parental alienating behaviors, there are times where the legal professionals involved do recognize that. And in conclusion, scholars studying parental alienation have argued that these parental alienating behaviors are a form of coercively controlling abuse. And this research adds to the already, wonderful body of literature that has theoretically discussed this and empirically examined it. More education into what these behaviors are and how to identify them would be helpful within the legal system and professionals involved in the legal system, so we can identify parental alienation early on and hopefully avoid getting into situations where children are severely alienated and perhaps intensive and more challenging interventions are needed. This will also help ensure that victims of abuse receive appropriate protection and treatment, both the targeted parents and the children that are victims. So with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Dr. Jennifer Harman and Dr. Demosthenes Lorandos. I really am new to this area, so I couldn't do all of this without the fabulous data set that they collected, but also the support and feedback that I've received. So yeah, thank you. And I've really enjoyed watching everyone's talk today, and I'm open to any questions you might have.
This might be Amanda's camera, so I'm just here to relay questions if you have anything for her.
So a suggestion I'd like to make is about the possible confusion about terminology. So when we coercive control is defined in different ways by different groups. The suggestion of this most recent study was to include parental alienation behaviors as a form of coercive control, which I certainly believe and support. The confusion arises when we use the term intimate partner violence to include non-violent forms of violence. In other words, people are saying, using the term emotional abuse as a form of intimate partner violence. I think that's confusing, intellectually and conceptually confusing. So I suggest that we have a very clear demarcation between emotional abuse versus physical intimate partner violence.
Amanda, did you hear that?
I did, yeah, and that's noted. I'm, again, kind of new to some of the terminology in the literature, but I do understand the point and appreciate that feedback.
One more over here.
Where can you get a copy of the PA Power and Control Wheel?
Oh, so I found that online. So again, Amanda Sillers, who does a lot of excellent work talking about parental alienation and the findings out there, she created this illustration from the behaviors that were discussed in the chapter by Dr. Harman and Dr. Mathewson. So that I found it online because I was a little kind of last minute trying to, I knew it existed. So if you search the, I believe I was searching like, you know, parental alienation, wheel of power and control. Maybe if you type in her name, Amanda Sillers, it might come up as well. And I can share the slides. I don't mind. I can put these slides on the OSF page so that anyone can access them.
I had a quick question about the administrative data for findings of abuse. Did your study look at whether or not the findings of abuse that were mentioned in the appellate record were where the court had made a determination of abuse, or where the court had relied upon an administrative finding of abuse? And then I have a follow-up to that.
Yeah, I know exactly. So if it's, I believe it was both. So again, we had those two columns. The outcome of the abuse investigation was specific to that claim of abuse. So was it like, was there a separate criminal court where this was, where they were determining whether it occurred or not? Or was there like the police involved or Child Protective Services involved that validated this claim of abuse? And then there was whether the family court believed it occurred or not. So sometimes there wasn't agreement amongst them, or sometimes the family court didn't say anything about it, but the outcome, according to, you know, criminal court or CPS, was that it did occur. So if that was the case, we would say, yes, it occurred. Or sometimes when they got to family court, there would be new evidence that emerged that suggested it didn't occur. So in that case, we would say it didn't occur, kind of depending on, again, how much detail there was about why they were saying it was unsubstantiated. But yeah, I'd have to go through like all the details again of the spreadsheet. But I can answer your follow-up question as well.
I guess the follow-up point is that in my jurisdiction, I'm a lawyer in Texas. As you look forward, you said some of your future research might be about the administrative aspect is that it's very rare for a CPS finding to be challenged, number one. Number two, the balance of due process is with the report of allegation, not the ability to dispute it until it is administratively challenged. So I would encourage you to try to normalize your data in any subsequent work to see how often the administrative appeal resulted in a overturning of a finding of abuse. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that feedback. It is challenging because of the limited detail here, and it's certainly not perfect, but that is helpful to know.
I have just 2 points. One is on the point on...
We're actually out of time. I was supposed to give a hard stop. Could you do it briefly, in a minute?
Sure. On intimate partner violence, many state laws include domestic violence to include emotional abuse. Certainly in California, if you get a domestic violence restraining order, it includes emotional, psychological abuse, and so it's hard to unpack those two. And secondly, lots of courts will have findings of emotional, psychological abuse that amount to parental alienation. Without a finding of parental alienation, it's important to get those cases as well.
I agree and appreciate that feedback. I do think that there are situations where, and I've seen it again more going through these case studies. So kind of a qualitative approach that needs to be be more systematic, but where it's clear that there's emotional abuse that's being found that is parental alienation. It's just not being called that.
I was told to be very aggressive with hard stops. I'm sorry. It's we're on break for 15 minutes till 11:15. When we have Dr. Rhodes.